share, and please let me know if anyone is unable to see what is on the screen share. Sounds like it's working. So I am going to turn this over to Peter, and we will go through the presentation for you.
Hey everyone, Peter Holzman. You can go, yeah, next slide. We're going to walk through Cal targets and a little bit of an economic update, and then talk about the target adjustments just approved, and then talk about general fund overhead, which is everyone's favorite topic. Next slide. So Cal targets at like a very simple level. Cal stands for current allocation level. It's basically an expense forecast. What we're trying to do is take current ongoing council approved expenditures and inflate them for the next year. And that it's basically a combination of the inflation forecast and then current ongoing council approved general fund discretionary expenditures. And so that's the very top level. We can go to the next slide. And so just general definitions. The Cal target is resource planning process for bureaus where allocated general fund discretionary resources are centrally forecasted and managed. And so we'll be releasing these later today, where you get the big number that you'll budget to. Bureaus receive this allocation with overhead resources as applicable to balance their expenses. Cal is available as soon as council finishes Cal target adjustments, which was earlier this week. We got the last of them. And then I use them in my the forecast that we released mid-December to help determine ongoing and one-time resources available or not available. It's the other side of the revenue forecast is the expense forecast. Next slide. And so how are Cal targets calculated? It's not the most complicated. It's you take the last year's adopted budget of ongoing discretionary and overhead, and then you add in the compensation set aside that was available last year. And that gives you the base for the current year Cal target number. This is then inflated by a bureau-specific inflation factor, which we'll show in the next couple slides. You add or subtract any council-directed and approved allocations, and then subtract off overhead funding, and that gives you the Cal target for discretionary funding. Next slide. And so what is the weighted inflation factor? It's basically it's weighted so not counting COLA, because that is separate. That goes to compensation set aside and benefits. What we do is we take external materials and services and multiply it by the percentage of the budget that is spent on materials and services. So that forecast number times the forecasted inflation number times your proportion spent on EMS. And then we'll do the same thing for personnel services, but not using the cost of living or expended personnel, because again, that's in compensation set aside. We do it a 0.5% factor for drift. So like that should capture things like reclassifications and things along those lines. And those together give you a bureau-specific weighted inflation factor. Next, yeah. And so this is an old example. It's an old example because it's a simple example and things have gotten a little bit more complicated in recent years. But 2015-16, the police, they had a base budget of 157 million, 158 million. Adding in that year's compensation set aside, you have a total base of about 162 million. Their weighted inflation factor was 1%. You can see the actual computation below. And then there were no council adds or subtracts that year, and they are not funded by overhead. So we don't have to subtract anything off, and you get the total Cal target for police in that year was about 164 million. And this example does not include like the recent incremental changes that have happened over time to Cal targets, which is including non-rep merit, PFMLA, which goes into effect January 1st of next year, and which stands for Paid Family Medical Leave Act, which there will be an adjustment to your Cal target based off of PFMLA. And it also doesn't include other recent council directed adds or subtracts that may have affected your specific bureau. Could you go to the next slide? So what they are and what they are not. I think this is somewhat helpful to like kind of get ahead of any misapprehensions. It's very high level. It's very top down about high level resource allocation of ongoing general fund discretionary and overhead resources. And it recognizes those expenses at the macro level. But what it does not do is we don't look at specific personnel and granularly inflate every person in your bureau's salary or wages and count for reclassifications and things along those lines. And we don't do forecasts of like specific EMS needs. It's very top level. Next slide. And so what's in the Cal targets that we'll be previewing today? From BUMP, 2 programs were removed from the overhead cost pool to fund with discretionary funds. There were additional resources added to procurement services. These were both passed earlier in the week. There's some realignments among bureaus and some business areas. And then there was an additional bargain cost for the GFT-backed resources for ProTech that council approved in July that were added as a Cal target adjustment. Non-represented merit, we have advised and have been planning for a 3% non-rep merit. And so there will be an allocation for that in Cal. So Cal targets in general fund includes that amount as your base budget assumption. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Paid Family Medical Leave Act, which will be effective January. We had this as a policy set aside, and we basically now have moved it and actually dispersed it among bureaus based on your employees. Next slide. And so, apologies, I'm a little sick. The timeline, we're shooting to have the tables posted to the budget manual today. And I would like to have feedback, questions, any concerns you may have about those numbers, where those numbers came from next week, because this again is the baseline for the December forecast, as well as we just want to be able to load it into BFM. And so ideally, it will be loaded into BFM by the end of next week. And we'll let you know when that is done. And the forecast should be complete by December 16th. And the one thing I want to mention that, and this has kind of been my signaling to council and the like, is that right now I do not anticipate, and it's pretty close, so I'm much more comfortable saying that I do not anticipate the forecast necessitating any cuts to be taken. That doesn't mean council still can't choose to go for cuts, but right now the forecast does not seem to be necessitating cuts. And I think this is my last slide. So I'll pause here, and if there's any questions on this portion before we get into general fund overhead, I'll take a moment to hear those out.
Okay, so it sounds like there are no questions on Cal. So I'm going to move into general fund overhead. So if you need another cup of coffee, this is a really good time. Let's move on to general fund overhead. So general fund overhead, a lot of these slides have probably some information you may want to also look at or read later. That might be small because there's a lot of technical information. So it's basically one of the types of cost allocation at the city. It is governed by city financial policies. So this is a link to the policy if you'd like to read the policy. There's some technical components we'll go through on general fund overhead cost recovery. The schedule and development of the overhead model for the budget process, and then how changes in the overhead cost pool occur throughout the process. So at a very high level, there's general types of cost allocation used at the city. There's more of a direct service or an agency agreement model. So this is where you would see costs associated with your OMS internal services, such as fleet, facilities, risk management, and IT. There are bureau-to-bureau interagencies, and there is also city financial policy to give you more information on this type of cost recovery. There's then a direct budgeting model. And so this is where you are charging time and materials directly to a fund or agency outside of a home fund. So some examples of this are like the recreational cannabis fund or the grant fund. So these next few slides aren't going to talk about neither of these things. They are going to talk about the indirect service model that is used for general fund overhead. And is, again, like we said, highlighted in Financial Policy 2.08. So it is an indirect service model. Here's some of the language, also known as jargon of general fund overhead. So I'll be using some of these terms in the next few slides. There's the cost pool. This is what is allocated out. It is set in city financial policy and was recently reviewed for adherence to policy in the summer of 2022, so just recently. And to the point that Peter made earlier in this presentation, that is where we brought forward through the overhead committee a recommendation to council to adjust some programs in the cost pool that were no longer meeting the instruction or intent of the cost pool as described in city financial policy. We then have allocation metrics that have been agreed to and have been in use for, gosh, probably at least since 2009, 2010, maybe. And so this is basically how the cost pool is allocated to the paying funds. It's the 3-year average of fund level spending and filled positions as of January 1st of prior year. So basically the prior year is January 1st to 2022 position counts. It generally serves as a proxy data points for service because, again, this is an indirect service model. The General Fund Overhead Committee is the advisory body of city finance professionals. Its focus is on the allocation metrics, the cost pool, and the method of cost recovery. It is not a programmatic or program level review of the service delivery model used by those bureaus. We then have what are known as like the true ups or carryovers. So the cost pool is allocated at 100% budget. Bureaus in the cost pool may not fully spend this budget. So this underspending becomes the credit in the coming year's budget development. So that is what you may see referred to as the true up. And then lastly, we have decision packages. So how do costs increase in the cost pool? They come through council action with an impact to overhead paying funds allocated at that time. So the city financial policy, it provides the programs or services within the cost pool for indirect allocation. The criteria from these programs is to be a shared service program in the general fund, the cost allocation methodology and the metrics, and then the role clarity of the overhead model and the processes. So it's the criteria of the programs. If the service provides benefit to all city bureaus, if the service provides an oversight or regulatory function for city bureaus, if the service exists in the general fund, if the bureau demand for service is difficult to predict from one fiscal year to the next, and if the cost of the services are difficult to charge on through a rate times unit model. So this is all basically pulled from city financial policy. It is not all inclusive. So it is not to say that a program in the cost pool must check all of these boxes. What the intent of the policy is to highlight these general areas. I saw a hand go up and then go down. Is there a question?
No, I'm just trying to see if you can slow down a little bit because it's too fast and it's not giving time, at least for me, to digest what you are explaining.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
I will try and do that. So the General Fund Overhead Committee, this is each of these lines, again, is taken from the city financial policy on the overhead committee. It's an advisory body convened by the CBO. They provide feedback and recommendations to the budget office for the allocation of general fund overhead cost pools. The budget director has a final determination on the policy of the cost pool. Financial policy provides that the committee assess the metrics every 5 years. Financial policy also lists bureaus that participate but not provide, and it does not provide any additional or more formal charter for this group. The group generally meets at least 2 to 3 times per fiscal year. The committee, like I mentioned before, does not weigh in on the workload or program efficacy or the service outcomes. It is about the management or the allocation of an indirect service pool. So this just looks lovely on a cold December day. Programmatically, what is in the cost pool? Programs, in some cases, whole bureaus may be in the general fund overhead cost pool. The sections here on this portion of the slide largely pulled from city financial policy, which we will need to now bring a revised policy to city council to reflect the decisions in FIN 2.08 that were made with this fall bump. That basically is now to catch the policy up with the policy council has adopted. So lots of process. There are some programs that are 100% funded via this model. So council offices, the auditor's office, government relations, budget office, city attorney's office, follow a 100% allocation. With the caveat for the attorney's office, there also are additional interagencies that are then passed on to bureaus. Majority of bureaus in the cost pool have a mix of resources, just as many bureaus have a mix of resources of general fund discretion, overhead, or other funding sources. So the next group, OMF, which has a lot of the internal programs identified on this slide, plus the Revenue Bureau, all have different mixes of what is included in both their cost pool and in their general fund discretionary programming. And then there are specific programs that are in the cost pool. So comprehensive planning activities at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and then PBEM Emergency Operations are 2 examples of programs. Office of Equity Human Rights, Office of Community and Civic Life, Portland Fire and Rescue, and Special Appropriation Membership and Dues. So these are also spelled out in the policy online, but this is basically how the cost pool has an eclectic mix of what has met the criteria and is then allocated this way. So this is looking at what does this mean budgetarily. These numbers are the 22-23 adopted. This is not the allocation for 23-24 that is working in its draft form to go out with CalTargets. So as you can see, numbers wise, this is where the programs that are allocated generally are housed within bureaus. These numbers do not represent the total resources that go into the bureaus identified with them. They only reflect the cost pool portion of these programs. This is just the same chart with the same descriptor. However, it is looking at the percent of the pool. So the cost allocation methodology is set to provide, and this is in priority order, stability, predictability, and equity of charges. And then this slide also has a little bit more detail on the metrics outlined in financial policy for, with the intention of providing some of that stability, is to use a 3-year rolling average of the size of a fund's budget based on the annual audited expenditures and the number of filled positions by fund. And then these metrics are weighted 75% around budget expenditures and 25% for positions. source data. The position count for the position allocated metrics come from payroll as of SAP payroll as of January 1st. So for FY 22-23 budget development, this was January 1st, 2021 positions in SAP, filled positions in SAP. And the reason for that is I would not have filled positions for January 2022 if I was developing the overhead model in December of 2020. I'm sorry, in December of 2021. I would need to use the most recent January. The expense by fund data comes from the audited prior year expenses as available with the city's annual comprehensive financial report. So then the expense categories are further broken down to personal services, external materials and services, and capital outlay, which is discounted at 50%. So external materials and services are included, internal material and services are not. The reason for this is because that quite often represents internal agency expense and revenues as they are allocated between different bureaus and funds. And so what we were really looking at, or the intention behind this, is to have the direct expenses as the weighted factor for allocating the cost pool. So the life cycle of the general fund overhead model, between September, October, metrics are updated and validated. The SAP filled positions and the audited financials become available. So I think we saw the announcement from Central Accounting that the audit was completed in early November and published early to mid-November. So that provides a set of metrics that become available at that point in time. While I might have the position data earlier, I do not have the audited budgeted financial data until this point in time based on the source. The cost pool is then developed. So this includes the work that Peter has described as a part of developing the CalTarget, and then any CalTarget adjustments that come from council through the fall supplemental budget process. We like to aim to have that draft in November, but as we saw, it wasn't voted on until 2 days ago. So here we are in December. And again, with that initial target is to really have the information available to bureaus as early as possible based on the inputs that go into development of the model. That becomes the requested base for general fund overhead charges to bureaus and for general fund overhead resource to bureaus that are funded through the overhead model. The mayor's proposed budget and then the spring bump are two inputs that happen between May and June that have impact on the size of the cost pool. So during the mayor's proposed budget, the mayor will have the opportunity to make adjustments to file his proposed budget or her proposed budget. And so if there are decision packages to either add or reduce in programs in the cost pool, that is when the cost pool would see change. The split or the allocation of how much of that cost pool is overhead versus discretionary stays constant through the process. So it doesn't get rerun in its entirety at every incremental change. What we are talking about from the mayor's proposed forward is only the changes to the cost pool that is allocated. The second item is spring bump carryover. So if there are carryovers in the program in general fund cost pool bureaus that are approved in the spring bump, those generally are timed to be incorporated with the mayor's proposed budget, and that those then become a one-time carryover into the cost pool. And then the last opportunities for changes to the cost pool, once it first starts with the mayor filing the proposed, would be if there are changes via decision package that council would make in either the approved or the adopted phases. And at the end of that is when it becomes the final adopted overhead model and cost pool. So this is, again, just a slightly modified way to recap, which is that general fund bureaus receive their resources through current appropriation levels. So the CalTargets are established after the fall bump. the current year adopted budget for ongoing general fund and discretionary, plus the inflation and any CalTarget adjustments in the fall bump. Those may impact both regular general fund discretionary backed programs, and they also may impact programs in the overhead cost pool. So changes to both of these also are typically like if it's after the CalTarget, if it is an increase or a decrease, they generally follow through a decision package format through the life cycle of the city's budget process. The cost pool doesn't change without an action by council, so a decision package or a CalTarget adjustment. And then that is basically leads to the last box on this. Sorry, I had a cat climbing up my lap. That felt great. But the last box of this is that the increments become smaller and smaller. They are a portion of this, and I know it can be quite a surprise to think that this part of the budget might be done, but this is how it is impacted at later phases in budget development. So that is my last slide. If there are questions for either CalTargets or overhead cost pool components, we're happy to take them now. Doesn't sound like there are questions or seem like it. A couple more moments for folks to think about that. I do understand sometimes it might be easier to have your number in front of you for your bureau to say, okay, now I have questions. So if that is where we feel, then we can all get back to finishing those numbers so we can get them to you. But I do want to make sure if there are items that you would like to ask for the group or of us, that we can be available to have that conversation now.
So this is Ayman from Housing Bureau. I'm just confirming we are supposed to receive the preliminary CalTargets end of day today.
That's the target for the CalTargets. So yes, we're basically what we will post similar to prior years. We have a series of tables that pull out different components of the CalTargets for bureaus to look at. This is going to be the resource side. So the way to think about this for your bureau may be we are highlighting what you would see in general ledger account 487110 for your discretionary, or if it is a cash transfer, what you would see in a cash transfer coming from the general fund to the receiving fund.
And usually there isn't considerable variances between the preliminary CalTargets and the final ones. And also, what's the date for the final CalTargets?
I'm going to let Peter take the potential variances question, and then Will can talk a little bit more about the date.
The variance is if you catch anything, basically. So doesn't always happen. Last year was a relatively complicated year, so because there was a lot of add backs in terms of things that council took away and then we're adding back. For most bureaus, it will be exactly right, but every once in a while something slips through the cracks and someone catches something. And then final CalTargets is the end of next week.
Yeah, I think that's what we are aiming for, is the end of next week. So I would be happy to get them done sooner, but we also recognize that we want people to have a little bit of time with the macro level number, understanding the and to the extent you would like to walk through like the actual what was my inflation factor, how much of this was for this, like we can do that. We're happy to take that effort if that is of assistance, but we wanted to make sure that the main things that we tend to sort of, I guess, catch would be if there was something that was in the add subtracts this was supposed to come back. There was a budget note 3 years ago that said this was coming back kind of item. If it's in a decision package, which is obviously a preference, then it would be in the base for the 487-110 that we would see this. And that's why it is not a, hey, this thing got forgotten conversation.
And questions concerned about the CalTargets, if bureaus have any reviews or anything, would be worked directly with the bureau's analyst or with Peter? Who's the point of contact for that?
You can ask me first, and yeah, just ask me.
All right. Thank you.
All right, and we'll have this information to you guys hopefully shortly today. That's the goal. Like Peter said, please reach out if you have questions on the computation of CalTargets with him. If you have questions on overhead, we were kind of a little joint team on that because CalTarget is the basis of overhead model. So you know, you can definitely reach out to both of us on those. And certainly if there are questions on timeline. One other component of timeline, since I know everyone wants to know the calendar, we did file the calendar for the big budget dates. So like mayor's proposed dates, when we can expect the approved hearing date, the adopted budget dates. They follow what was in our preliminary budget manual dates, but they have been filed on a consent agenda resolution for next week for council to adopt those as the dates that we will be using for the basis of the budget calendar. So final reminder on that, it is not a binding resolution. There is potential for like a work session to be added or dropped, or a listening session date to change based on availability. So I always want to caveat that, but we will have that basically that more official timeline considered more official, hopefully by the end of next Wednesday.
Can you share the PowerPoint with this group?
Yes. So the similar to prior sessions that we have done, the PowerPoint will be posted to the online budget manual with a recording of this meeting to our YouTube channel. Be sure to like and subscribe. I can't help myself. Yes, so that will be available today as well, and we will send that information out with all of the live links when it is ready. All right. I hope everyone has a